Hello everyone and welcome to my build video of the Freewing SU-35. This is an absolutely fantastic EDF model of the Russian Sukhoi Su-35S super flanker. It certainly can be flown as it comes in stock configuration, but to make the most out of it, there are a few changes and modifications that you may consider going through. First, let's get some context. This airframe, as good as it is, it's pretty old already, but it remains a winner in many regards, both aesthetically and in flight features that few other jets in the market can compete with. It remains a winner in many regards, especially since this model features thrust vectoring nozzles. There is barely any competition at all in that regard, as there has been a growing tendency from manufacturers to keep thrust vectoring features out of the newer product releases, probably in order to appeal to a wider audience, which in my opinion it is a real pity. That kind of explains why there's still so much people interested in this jet, despite being a product from 2011. And as such, we often see new pilots asking for advice about this jet in the RCGroups forum. So I have been thinking about doing a build video for quite a long time. I wanted to make first the video of the FPV build, as I have been asked many times to do so. I hear you guys, I haven't forgotten about you, but there are many unresolved issues with my FPV Su-35 setup that I want to properly sort out before I get to feel like giving advice to other people about it. This aircraft has 2 threads dedicated to it over at RCGroups with almost 2000 pages. Of course, that's a great source of knowledge for this bird, but it is also a pain if you need to go through all of them to find the answers or advices that you seek, so I will try to sum it up here. On one hand, the common knowledge about this aircraft gained from years of experience by an entire worldwide community flying it, and on the other, my personal thoughts, of course. Okay, that was a hell of a long intro, so let's not waste more time and get right to the thick of it. Here goes the first consideration about this model. Keep the packaging foam that comes with the plane. It makes for an amazing workbench and helps you protect the airframe both in storage and when moving your jet to the field and back. Just don't throw it away, it comes pretty handy. I have cut the sides and the front of it so that I can store the jet without disassembling the Tailerons or the nose. Actually, the nose is designed to be glued in, but you could put some magnets in it, and then you would only need to cut the sides for the Tailerons, which would make storage and transportation that much easier. I do use magnets to fix the tail cone, but we will get to that later. The plane usually comes from factory something like this, with the servo wires already led through, but we don't really want them like that. It's much better to use individual wires for each control surface, so we will remove them later. The battery compartment hardly provides enough space to work with the servo wires and plain electronics, so the first thing we should do is to get a sharp set of blades and carefully cut a new opening right behind the battery hatch, following the panel lines on the fuselage. Mind that you should cut the lateral sides of this new opening at a beveled angle of about 45 degrees so that it will fit back easily afterwards, as shown in the pictures. Once you are done with that, use the blades to remove a bit of unnecessary foam from the battery housing. This will make everything much easier to set up later on. In particular, it will give you more space to install components in the gaps of the fuselage to the sides of the battery housing. You will truly appreciate this modification later on when we get to the installation of the electronic components, as now you will be able to pass your fingers through and see what you are doing. Going back to the battery hatch, you just need to glue the new opening back to the main hatch using contact glue. Make sure that the angle of union is correct and that the piece stays aligned with the rest of the fuselage when the hatch is closed. You may need to fine adjust the foam or add something in between the two pieces to get a perfect fit. Additionally, you may want to trim the foam underneath the hatch so that we can fit and install the receiver here. This configuration allows to have clear access to the receiver at any given time, which, needless to say, simplifies things up. This position also allows to lay wires directly to the tail and wings of the plane without needing to pass wires through the battery compartment, which is also a great plus. At this point, we are ready to turn the plane over and start working on the belly. Gently lay the fuselage upside down over the plane's packaging box, unscrew the cover of the speed controllers and remove the plastic cover that hides the space reserved for the wires going to the tail. Unscrew the EDF foam covers as well and take them out. All the pieces that we remove can be stored inside the packaging box so that they do not get lost. Just like I explained earlier, the box comes super handy. Now that the guts of the aircraft are wide open, it is time to remove all the factory installed wires and components, as we will be doing our own clean installation with separate wires and possibly custom components. Peel out the tape covering the servo wires under the EDFs and take them all out, including the wires coming from the servos that operate the thrust vectoring nozzles. Everything goes out. Now that the belly is empty, we have space to trim out the foam where the ESCs had been previously. This should help gain some extra space and improve ventilation of the speed controllers during flight. Next comes one of the most critical modifications that I would recommend, which is to reinforce the vertical stabs with carbon fiber rods. This is mandatory if you want to use the rudders as aerodynamic air brakes by symmetrical outwards deflection. And even if you don't plan to use rudder brakes, it remains a very advisable modification to increase the reliability of the model. A few guys that didn't do it had their rudders collapse in midair, and you can guess that it didn't end well for them. The carbon fiber rod installation is a bit tricky, and is better done with help from a friend. If you don't care about the rudders being removable, you may just as well glue them in with epoxy, and that will pretty much have the same effect. To install the carbon rods, you first screw the rudders in place and get a long skewer stick of about 2 mm diameter. Mark a cross where you want the rod to go through on the bottom of the fuselage and use the stick to carve your way through. It is very important that the rudders remain installed and tightened through the process so that we get the tightest fit possible without causing a vertical deviation of the rudders. Mind also that you should align the rod with some clearance so that it doesn't hit the lower rudder hinge. Then use a square to make sure that you are carving through the foam at a right angle. That's why you should do this with some help, as you won't be able to tell if you are aligned correctly in the lateral plane. Have a friend instruct you whether to tilt the stick to port or starboard as you puncture the foam. To make the hole, it helps to keep rotating the stick with your fingers as you go. Mark the stick with the desired length of your carbon rods that you wish to drill the rudders with, and keep screwing it until the mark meets the bottom of the fuselage. At that point, you can take the stick out and drive the carbon rod in. If the fit is tight, for example, if you use a 3 mm rod, you may not even need to glue it in place, as it will hold on by friction. Otherwise, remove the rudder from the plane and glue the rod directly to the rudder. Once you are done with the first rudder, you repeat the exact same process with the second one. Okay, now is a good moment to start installing any servos that you may want to change. Personally, I would replace at least the Taileron ones by this Turnigy 306 shown on the picture, because they are the most important control surfaces on this model. I would also recommend changing the one that controls yaw axis for the thrust vectoring nozzles, as you want some decent speed there for good control in high alpha. And besides, this servo drives two nozzles on its own, so it suffers more than the others and is more likely to fry, strip, or fail in general. The 306 is fast, precise and lightweight. Not super cheap, but it improves precision and reliability where it is most required. For the rest of the aircraft, you can either keep with the stock servos as long as they are the newer Metal Gear version, or otherwise I would recommend the Corona DS-939MG model. Besides being cheap, those are extremely reliable and feature high torque. On the downside, they are pretty slow, but since we already installed fast servos on the Tailerons, you will find that it is not that much needed on the rest of the plane. The Corona 939s are almost a direct fit to the Freewing servo housings. You just need to remove a small plastic tab with pliers and you are good to go. Regarding the 306Gs that go on the Tailerons, you will need to make a custom fit. Here's how I do it. I cut matching pieces of plastic sheets from hotel room cards that I collect and slide them in until the servo is really tight in place with the servo arm centered. When you are done getting it tight, you have to cut an extra layer and place it above the servo so that the top plastic plate of the servo housing can put pressure on the servo when you screw the plate back in. This last layer should be glued to the servo, because otherwise it can slide into the path of the servo arm and mess things up. A droplet of contact glue will be more than enough. For the thrust vectoring yaw servo, you will need to widen the gap as well so that the servo fits in. Oh, and I totally forgot to tell you earlier, but before this you should totally start by manually centering the arms of all the servos with a servo tester that has a fixed center feature. Do not use the knob for this as it will not be precise. You go servo by servo, plugging them on the tester and making sure that they are dead center. If necessary, unscrew the arms and screw them back in while the servos are still powered. To ensure that you get the best centering possible, servo arms straight at 90 degrees. This will save you a few headaches later on. Now, before getting the wires back in the fuselage belly, we will first install the electronic components, so that we can measure and optimize wire length accordingly and make the installation as clean and functional as possible. In this airframe I am using an Eagle Tree Guardian 2D 3D gyro that controls all three axes of the vectoring nozzles. I have it on a 3-position switch that turns it on and off and defines the operating mode. Furthermore, I can control the master gain with a knob. Putting the gyro on the nozzles barely affects normal flight, but it makes a massive difference in stability regarding high alpha performance, which is certainly desirable if you intend to replicate the radical maneuvers of the full-scale aircraft with any degree of consistency. It also improves massively the operational safety margins, as the plane is much more predictable in situations that would otherwise lead to a loss of control and a possible crash. The plane doesn't need the gyro as such, it can be flown without it perfectly fine, but it is an addition that I would totally recommend. It doesn't replace the pilot, instead it allows him to go beyond what is physically possible with our human reflex times. That's up to you, of course, and your personal preference. The type of gyro and the speed of the servos that it commands also have a massive effect on the way the plane will behave. And don't forget that since the gyro only commands the nozzles, it will have zero effect when there is no thrust. Also mind that the gyro has a normal and head and hold mode. For plane operation, normal mode works much better. Head and hold can be used if you know what you are doing, and it has some uses, but better just focus on the normal direct rate functionality. Since the gyro takes 5 channels from the receiver and works best by placing it centered in the aircraft, I decided to install both gyro and receiver side by side under the hatch opening that we made at the beginning of the build. It is the perfect place for them in my opinion. I am using an FrSky X8R receiver in D16 mode with telemetry enabled. To get the 16 channels, I used 2 additional 4-channel SBUS decoders from FrSky. They plug straight into the SBUS port using a Y wire. With all that said, we play with the positions of the receiver and gyro until we are satisfied with the outlay, and then mark their positions in preparation to fix them in place with contact glue. Make sure that the battery hatch will be able to close before you proceed to glue them in. Once you are satisfied with your selected position, apply contact glue on the surface of the foam, stick the components on it and remove them. Then wait for 15 to 20 minutes until the glue is semi-dry and stick them in their respective places using the previously prepared markings. This method doesn't allow for corrections, so you need to get it right at the first attempt. Take your time and be precise. Now we can glue the PCV antennas in their positions as shown on the picture using contact glue as well. I use this same space in the starboard side of the battery compartment to fit a 2-cell 600 mAh battery that will provide clean power to the aircraft. The main battery should power only the speed controllers and the ducted fans. I won't go into further details here, but enough to know that if you use an external power supply for the jet, you need to remove the red wire from the ESC leads that plug into the receiver. To hold the receiver battery in place, you can just glue a Velcro as the picture suggests. This receiver battery is small enough that the Velcro will totally hold it in place even through the most hardcore maneuvers. To the other side of the battery compartment, we will allocate the two SBUS decoders and the external BEC that regulates the voltage stability of the receiver power supply. You will likely need to solder in the connectors of your choice. I use a Turnigy 8 to 15 amps external UBEC regulator on all my jets and 2mm banana type connectors. To prevent these connectors from having an accidental short circuit, I wrap the positive male connector of the battery in heat shrinking covers as depicted in the images. I am not using the landing gear sequencer that comes with the plane. Instead, I mix everything directly on the radio, so that I can have independent control of both the landing gear and gear doors for practical maintenance and repair work. In that sense, all the landing gear wires, including the steering servo, will plug to one of the SBUS decoders, taking 3 channels. The other decoder takes care of the ailerons and rudders, taking 4 channels. The 3 spare channels on the receiver are reserved for the Tailerons and the speed controllers, reducing the number of wire connections and devices that could possibly fail to the most critical controls of the aircraft. Now that we have sorted out the electronic components on the battery compartment, we can get to the belly and finish the installation of the wires. We ditch the Y wires that come pre-installed from factory for the rudders, ailerons and Tailerons and replace them with individual wires. This allows the Tailerons to be programmed to function like the ones on the full-scale aircraft, deflecting symmetrically for pitch control and asymmetrically for roll. It also allows the ailerons to be used as flaperons and the rudders as rudder bricks, so we gain a lot of potential for customization and scale features. What we can do in order to easily reduce unnecessary wire length is to connect the corresponding wires to either the receiver, SBUS decoder or gyro output and run them back to the servos that they need to control. Then the excessive wire can be stored on the aft compartments of the aircraft, leaving a clean battery compartment that is easier to work with. Do leave some margin always though, as we don't want tight wires that may unplug when the aircraft is under stress. Also label the wires for quick identification, at least on the receiver end of the leads. Once we are satisfied with the layout of the wires, we can fix them back in, install back the ducted fans, glue the speed controllers to the sides of the compartment that is designed for them, and then we can finally screw the EDF covers back in and close all the hatches and wire compartments from the plane's belly. Now let's move forward to the control surfaces and make a few critical considerations. The first thing to do is to take the wings and vertical stubs and put a few drops of epoxy glue on the hinges of the ailerons and rudders. Of course, you have to be very careful not to put the glue on the moving part, since that would lock the hinges in place. This part is very critical in order to reduce free play on the control surfaces. That does not only improve the precision of the aircraft response, but also ensures that your trim settings do not randomly change over time, giving the plane a more locked-in feeling and taking out the sloppiness. It will also improve the aircraft's resistance to impact or damage. Regarding the Tailerons, they are very precise already as they pivot over a carbon axis, but unlike the rest of the control surfaces, the control horn of this linkage is absolutely undersized for the task. The Tailerons are large and deal with huge forces during flight, and since the horn contact surface with the foam is very small, it will inevitably cause it to deform over time and develop a humongous slack. So those horns need to be replaced with some bigger ones with a bigger contact surface. It is also a good idea to use ball links for ultimate precision, but that's not so critical. Whatever you do, change the control horns on the Tailerons, and I would even recommend to glue them in addition to securing them with the screws, as that will improve the load distribution of the horn and it will work better overall. Other than that, you can just install the Tailerons as per the instruction manual. Regarding the linkage itself, I would recommend to use the farthest hole from pivot point of both the servo arms and control horns, in order to further increase the control resolution. If for whatever reason you want to reduce the throws mechanically, attach the control link on the second farthest hole on the servo arm and leave the control horn as is. As for centering the control surfaces, first of all you should power on the aircraft and make sure that all the trims and sub-trims are centered. Then keep the plane powered so that the servos don't move accidentally, and you can fine adjust the linkage arms by rotating the plastic end that attaches to the control horn. The ailerons and the rudders are easy to set up as they just need to be aligned with the lines of the wing and vertical stabs respectively. The Tailerons and nozzles are a bit more tricky, but the idea is the same. For the nozzles, you will notice that there are marks on the plastic bolts so that you can center them, but for the plane to fly straight, you will need a little bit of pitch-up deflection. Use the marks on the underside of the plane as reference and leave a gap of 2 to 3 mm between the marks and the plastic housing. You can fine-tune later by doing vertical powered climbs. The alignment of the Tailerons, on the other hand, will depend on the plane's CG and flap configuration. What I would recommend is to have 3 separate modes on your transmitter with independent trims so that it's easy to retrim each flight configuration on its own. Mind that deploying the landing gear on this aircraft shifts the center of gravity back and affects the trim as well. So the first mode would be clean configuration with flaps up, gear up. Second configuration would be flaps up, gear down, and finally dirty configuration with flaps down, gear down. That can be easily done on a Tailerons transmitter, for example, with the flight modes functionality. I recommend using a CG between 160 to 170 mm compared with 145 to 155 recommended by Freewing, which is way too nose heavy. Ideally, you should start with either 160 to 165 mm and work your way back to 170 progressively over the flights if you really feel like it. With this center of gravities, the plane will balance anywhere between 7.5 to 10 mm of pitch at trim on the Tailerons, measuring the distance from the leading edge of the Taileron at root core to the top line of the wooden piece that makes for the ventral fins. When flaps are deployed, it usually needs a touch of additional pitch-up trim, but it is often minimal. Evidently, that will be just a starting point for a first flight and should fine-tune in the air on a calm day during your first flights. Make sure that you program the trims on the transmitter to affect only the Tailerons. If your trim changes the nozzle alignment, you will find yourself having a very hard time trying to get this jet to fly well. Failing to do so could potentially lead to a crash. Be warned. The proper way to trim a model aircraft is first to trim the plane for dead stick level flight at about 50% throttle. Then gain some good altitude, cut the throttle, let the plane slow down and proceed to perform a 45-degree dive with the hands off the sticks. If the plane sharply pulls out of the dive back to level flight on its own, It means that the plane is very nose heavy. If the plane recovers only slightly as it gains speed, it's slightly nose heavy, which is okay for most pilots. If the plane tracks straight at 45-degree angle without deviating, the balance is perfect, but the plane will be less stable and will require a greater pilot skill. Finally, if the plane tries to ditch even deeper, instead of recovering from the dive, that means your jet is actually tail heavy. Pull out of the dive immediately, reduce speed, and land as soon as possible. May the gods be with you. Taking this into consideration, you can now move the battery or components to shift the aircraft's center of gravity forward or backwards. Then go for another flight, retrim the plane for level cruising at half throttle and repeat the nosedive test. Keep doing this until the plane recovers only slightly or maintains well the dive angle. With that, we finished adjusting the Tailerons. Only after this step is completed shall we begin to fine-tune the alignment of the nozzles. The way to check the thrust vectoring trim is to sharply throttle up and down, both in level flight and in vertical climbs. If you notice a tendency to pitch up when you add throttle in both scenarios, then you should reduce pitch up trim on the nozzles. Otherwise, increase it until the plane doesn't pitch up or down regardless of speed and throttle position. Mind that if you adjust this plane with a center of gravity of 170 mm, it will naturally show a tendency to pitch up at very low speeds, requiring some input from the pilot to hold the nose down. You will also notice that with such extreme CG positions, the plane pitching dynamics invert during high alpha at around 45-degree angle of attack, meaning that to keep the nose at a constant angle, you will need to shift from pulling on the elevator stick to actively pushing the nose down. That's absolutely fine and to be expected if you want the best performance out of this aircraft, especially in high alpha flight. Again, this takes more pilot workload, so you may want to start with the CG at 160 to 165 mm. Going back to the plane modifications, there are still a couple of pretty important things to do on the battery compartment. First of all, the foam of the nose landing gear housing usually cracks from landing impacts, so we should better reinforce it right away. It is enough to glue a piece of balsa wood as shown in the pictures about 3 mm in thickness. You can either use contact glue or epoxy. Then we have to attach another Velcro strap for the battery pack, as the stock one will likely be too far forward for a proper grip. To do this, I passed a couple of thin carbon fiber rods through the foam as portrayed in these images. Then cut the central foam piece, passed the battery strap under the carbon rods and glued everything back with epoxy, locking the strap in place. To get the CG where we want it, we will likely need the battery to go to the rear of the battery compartment, and we will likely need to trim a bit of foam from the battery hatch handle housing so that it fits. I use a 6S 500 mAh Turnigy Panther LiPo. Again, this video is not sponsored, I am just pointing to the gear that I have found works best for me. If you have problems taking off, say if your club has a rough grass runway, you may also want to slightly increase the height of the nose landing gear, but I would advise against that unless you really need it, so we'll jump the details, this video is already too long. Also, regarding the tail cone, I like the ability to easily detach it for transportation, so I glued 3 magnets on each side and a carbon fiber rod that guides it in for good measure. After gluing the magnets, it is a good idea to cover the entire surface of the tail cone and fuselage joints with a thin layer of epoxy. This distributes the load of the magnets and prevents them from getting torn out of the foam after a couple of uses. Of course, wait a couple of days until the glue is totally dry and even rub with some alcohol before attempting to assemble the tail cone, or you may not be able to ever detach it again. With that said, we have already covered most of the important aspects of the build. It is also a good idea to remove the pilot head and the nose landing gear cosmetic reinforcement strut, as these add useless weight on an airframe that already struggles with thrust to weight ratios. And since we already opened the cockpit to take the pilot out, we may also want to add a few scale details, such as changing the black head-up display plastic by a clear one, maybe adding a green LED for additional dramaticism, painting the cockpit interior in the right tonality of blue, or even adding some kind of multifunction display mockups as I did. I also painted the wheel hubs of the jet in green, whatever makes you feel right at this point. Also, feel free to install your preferred ducted fan systems. The stock ones are a little bit disappointing in terms of thrust. Installing slightly heavier and more powerful motors will also help in balancing the CG, as you will not need to push the battery so far back. Well, we made it this far. I guess this pretty much covers the fundamentals of the Freewing SU-35. If you have any further questions or doubts, I would encourage you to head over to the RCGroups threads, and I will likely be there with a whole bunch of other SU-35 freaks, ready to give further advice to those that need it. I will leave the links in the video description below. Also, if you like this kind of videos, please let me know with your comments, I would appreciate the feedback. And since I have your attention, let me take the chance to salute and wish good fortune and smooth flights to all my EDF comrades all over the world. Also, big thank you to my Patreons, my subscribers, and all the people that in one way or another has contributed to my channels. Maybe someday I will make the build video for the FPV airframe as well, but for the time being, this is it. I hope this was useful in any measure. Make sure to subscribe and hit the bell button so that you don't miss any future video. See you in the next one!